Well, hello everyone to another Africa Hospitality Investment Forum podcast, the AHIF podcast, as we like to call it. The podcast that looks to spread a little light and insight into the hospitality industry in Africa, and especially with a focus on investment. I'm here with Hala Matar Choufany, the president of HVS in Middle East, Africa, and I believe also Asia. We're here to talk about everything Africa today. Hala, welcome.
Hi, Matt. Thank you.
It's lovely to see you, and thanks for joining, and thanks for also getting in the spirit of wearing the African bright colours today.
Absolutely. I think we're both already in a mindset. We're in Africa. We're in
Now,
Kenya.
if nothing else, people will at least be blinded by the colours that we're wearing today.
It's about Africa, right? And I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about it, but there's so much on the horizon there. So that's exciting.
Wow, we'll get to that. So, firstly, for those that don't know about HVS particularly, tell us a little bit about what sort of broad brush advisory do you provide across the Middle East and Africa region?
Sure. I mean, HVS is a consultancy firm that focuses specifically on the hospitality and tourism industry. We have been present in the Middle East and Africa for a good 15 years now. We're very much involved in feasibility studies at the very inception stage, looking at what schemes are sustainable, helping owners understand the scheme, looking at the financial returns, the risks, and the rewards, and predominantly is actually developing a bankable document for financing purposes. For assets that do exist, we are very much involved in asset managing, optimizing performance. Really, the core of HVS is around valuation, whether in the transaction space or just looking at optimizing value. Therefore, we do asset management as well as operator placement. So we'd like to think of it as the full cycle of the hospitality industry from inception until
And
disposal. Yeah.
that's why I sort of asked the question in the sense that, are you actually seeing a section of that specific set of services being more utilized or more in demand now in Africa? And if so, does that actually tell you a story about what's going on in the African market?
Right. So that's quite a broad question because I think Africa, when we talk about Africa, I mean, we're all in agreement that this is such a large continent, right? And
Yeah.
it's not different. I mean, at times we talk about Africa as being very different to other continents. It's not different. There are certain markets that are more mature or more established, and there are others that are emerging, and perhaps some because they are limited by current political or economical challenges they haven't developed as yet, right? So looking at Africa is just try to understand the differences in the market, and this is where our services also differ. So in markets, and I'll give you specifically an example being Cape Town, we're already at the transaction stage. We're currently assisting owners with selling a property, right?
Yeah.
Whereas this is very different to other parts of Africa where we are looking more at conversions and potentially bringing in operators. So it really depends on market cycle. And there are imbalances, I would say. There are certain markets that are definitely um, achieving growth. And from a recovery standpoint, they've recovered well. And they have been the better performing markets in Africa. We're seeing now a couple of markets that are picking up, actually. I mean, they've always been known for tourism, but they have become more aggressive in their tourism strategy. And I'll give an example being Morocco, for instance. And when we look at North Africa, being specifically Cairo, historically Cairo is a very established market, but we've definitely seen in the last 3 4 years much more interest from the international operators as well as acquisitions. So our services then really follow the cycle of the market. For most part, where I think the real opportunity still is within the feasibility studies is identifying those schemes. Are they standalone schemes? Are they part of mixed use? What does it mean? How does it tie into the bigger picture of the tourism infrastructure? So this is just broadly around Africa in terms of services and how we're coming in to really assist owners and developers.
And again, on the feel free to specify which markets, but some of the big issues a decade ago into Africa were, visa, air connectivity, some of these big challenges that were holding development opportunities to Africa. And in some cases, some have never moved, some have improved. But what do you think now are some of the biggest challenges that the African market faces? And again, it might be specific to some individual markets that you would pull out.
So, Matt, I mean, we're kind of repeating ourselves because, if these challenges aren't resolved, then there remain to be challenges, right? And
Yeah,
connectivity is the biggest one. I think financing is another one, although I'll talk a little bit more about financing and now the opportunities because of what's happening globally. Perhaps we're seeing much more interest in Africa. So we'll talk
yeah,
about that. And this is where I would like to think about it more from an opportunity standpoint. But I think the real challenges historically have been connectivity. And now more than ever, perhaps also with the costs increasing and air tickets increasing, the prices increasing, this could be a challenge, but that's not also only for Africa. So the disadvantage Africa has had over the years that, with all the recent um, issues, whether it is with the COVID or more recently economic pressures, is that perhaps they are moving in the right direction, but extremely slowly because there are those external factors that couldn't be avoided, especially when you are in an emerging market and when you are so dependent on funding, right? So, but I think also we need to consider safety and mindset. And I don't know how oftentimes these have come up. And the reason I'm talking around mindset is that there is this general perception that it's very difficult to do business, and perhaps we need to start changing our mindset around it's very difficult. Let's find the solutions. And that's what I sometimes tell clients. Perhaps we don't need anymore to think about building a 300-room hotel. The trends are changing, right? So what if we were doing 100 keys hotel? Can we
yeah,
finance that? Right? So that's what I mean by mindset. Let's not, at times there is the fixations around the problems. And yes, the problems are real. And I'm not saying there are no
yeah,
challenges, but I'm saying let's look at the opportunities. Let's look at the fact that perhaps there are challenges to other countries, such as manpower and costs, which are the real opportunities in Africa. So, can we capitalize that? What can we do with that being at a lower cost versus the other investment costs that are at a higher risk? So, really balancing out. But I want to talk more specifically around financing because I think that's something worth just putting out there at the moment where we are at least seeing there's definitely much more appetite to invest in Africa on account of a number of reasons. And that could be a problem solver when it comes to financing, right? I mean, in the sense of um, looking at private equity firms that are
yeah,
now actually on the lookout in Africa. Now, whether we call it they're on the lookout to distressed assets or assets that are pretty much priced at fair value, I think this is something we're seeing along with the sovereign funds trying to also bring in public entities into such investments. These
yeah,
are will always remain relevant to the more at least established markets, but we're seeing more of that at the moment, which is an indication there is an overall economic slowdown. That is for sure, right?
yeah,
But we're seeing migration of some money into the Middle East naturally. But I want to focus specifically on Africa because, again, as I said, I think from an acquisition standpoint, perhaps it's the good time. I have clients at the moment from the US, for instance, looking at acquiring properties in Marrakesh, for instance, right?
yeah,
Yes, there's going to be conversion and upgrade of those properties, but at face value, the cost to acquire certain assets in Africa today vis-a-vis other markets is by far lower. If you think about the future potential, then there is a much larger gain, I would say, in terms of potentially capital appreciation as tourism picks up in those markets.
So private equity is sort of sniffing around and saying, I'm seeing some real value in this. Do the traditional finance houses still, the banks and so on, are they still a bit standoffish towards the hospitality industry, or are they seeing opportunity too?
I mean, they remain quite conservative. And my view is the lenders, unless they have a very good understanding of the market and they have established trading history, and we're talking about a number of markets here that it's hard to project, or you cannot rely necessarily on historic performance to project the future. So I understand where they're coming from. I don't anticipate them being the first movers into those markets, but they follow suit once there are certain transactions. And my view is we're going to be seeing a number of more transactions as well as investments, which would be encouraging. We're also seeing quite a number of investors from the Middle East specifically. I mean,
Mm.
there is a growing interest. It was there, and there is perhaps growing interest. Uh, at times it is an economic, political, but also much more in the sense of the ties between Africa and the Middle East. So we're seeing quite a number of those investments, outward investments from the UAE, perhaps
Yeah.
less so today as we speak from Saudi Arabia, but definitely from the UAE and other parts of the GCC into Africa.
So, what's your expectation then for the next 5 years for the market, in terms of, if this is an attractive proposition now, what do you expect to see to come out of it? More properties, or just conversions, or what's your thinking that's going to happen?
There's definitely an opportunity, and that could solve also a problem going back to financing. That's why I mentioned mindset earlier on. And we're seeing that not just in Africa. I mean, that's the sort of advice and recommendations we are providing to owners, even in parts of the Middle East. There is an inventory today in all those markets. Now, yes, one could argue they're subpar, they're local, they're not up to levels, not up to international expectations. However, there is enough to start off by looking at converting, at looking at renovating some of these assets instead of just going into a pure build situation. I mean, yes, naturally, you're going to have to build more hotels. But my view is when there are constraints, especially as it relates to financing constraints, you can still potentially bring to the market newer and renovated product. And we're seeing that very successful in markets like Egypt as well as Morocco, which suggests it does work. It will
Yeah.
require less of a capital investment, and automatically, as a market or as a city, you have 500 additional renovated rooms instead of building two hotels, right?
Yeah.
So that is one avenue to explore, and this is actually what is happening at the moment. That some of these assets are converting in the more established or perhaps in destinations where the government is more committed to developing tourism offering. There is going to be mixed use, and these are predominantly going to bring in a number of new properties. So there's going to always be a mix between the two. But I am of the view that with traveler preferences changing, and I'm not suggesting at all that there's going to be a segment of the market that will disappear. I think, if at all, in Africa, they can benefit very well and continue to benefit from business and MICE. So you're still going to have your business hotels. You're going to have hotels that are focused on providing quality meeting space, but they don't have to be excessively large hotels
No.
on one hand. On the other hand, with your leisure and your FIT, with the changes in preferences, the tendency is to go for something that is much more unique yet smaller. And that's why I personally believe that Africa has a lot of potential, given its landscape, given the diversity of the offering, all the way from Marrakesh to Angola to elsewhere, right? There is very different topography, yet you can bring in smaller investments,
Yeah.
create a strong and solid and attractive hospitality offering. So I think when we talk about hospitality, and there is a general agreement that we're no longer talking about your traditional hotel. We're looking at hospitality as a wider. It could be in the form of Airbnb. It could be converting some of your local homes into accommodation and really bringing in the local people to create that experience. And it could be also developing 20, 30, 40 key lodge somewhere where it's super attractive. uh, and I think this is what needs to be explored further rather than being fixated on building a high rise with 200 key hotel. in the middle of the city.
And in that respect, there's lots going on there. You obviously got a feel for this proposition. What HVS in Africa? What's the sort of goal for you over the next 5 years? What do you want to achieve in the market space?
Yeah, I think really our role, I'd probably describe it, or ideally how we would like to impact or play a role in helping grow tourism and supporting owners. One is working with governments to really identify a tourism strategy or a rollout of a tourism strategy. And we're happy to help. We have experience elsewhere globally. And I think we can add value, at least in trying to understand the current offering. How can this be upgraded? What can be done? How can we attract foreign investments, if at all? And how can we support the local market? So this is really looking at the public sector and the government. From a private developer investor standpoint, our responsibility lies with really trying to assist in developing concepts that will be financially rewarding, but more importantly, sustainable. The change continues to be so quick, right? So, we're not building for today, we're building
Yeah.
for 10 years down the road and trying just to anticipate what 10 years down the road would look like. And I think what I always stress is the responsibility of a consultant, and being HVS, I can speak definitely for HVS. We really need to support in creating a differentiated, to the extent possible, differentiated product rather than looking at mainstream and cannibalizing. And I think this is where we like to have those conversations from a very early on inception stage to really identify what is relevant, what is suitable to every market very specifically, what are the segments, and how are we going to deliver a project that will be financially very rewarding, but more importantly, that is going to be relevant in 5 years or 10 years down the road.
And you're obviously intimating there that, in 10 years down the line, this sort of smaller, perhaps more intimate type of hotel is perhaps coming into play. But you talked there about mixed use as well. And is is there's a talk of hotelization of real estate in the sense that real estate has been traditionally bricks and mortar, long leases and such like, and now with the management contract type of arrangement with hotels, that everyone's looking at what's going on inside, right? So are we sort of going to be finding that buildings are used for many different things in the future as well? Is this the trend that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what we're recommending as well. I mean, I come from a pure hospitality background
Yeah.
where, we were taught that, you derive your value predominantly from your room's revenue, right? And I've experienced that this was different when I worked in Asia. And then when I landed in the Middle East and I looked at the P&L and I was like, wow, 70% of the revenues is not coming from the rooms. It's actually coming from F&B, and more so today than ever, which is a valid argument as to why we are now looking at even a hotel being a mixed use income generator. So you've got your rooms, but you have a very solid F&B income, and you've got retail, and potentially you have working space, and you have an entertainment, and you have external membership. So it's a combination of all of this. Our advice has been to clients is to start measuring their revenue per square meter. Uh,
Yeah.
I
Real
know,
estate. Yeah.
right, as if you're doing the real estate, which wasn't the theory around how we looked at hotels, right? We looked at hotels with 250 keys and every room is 40 square meter or 20 square meters. Today, we're actually saying if you're not able to optimize your sellable areas, then it's very difficult to justify that investment on rooms only basis, because there are certain sensitivities and seasonality around rates and occupancy, right? Even in very strong markets, the sensitivity is there. So how are you going to balance out the risks associated with such investments, especially in emerging markets, right? So, there's a long way before maturity. So, to your point, absolutely. This is why I think now we stress more hospitality than hotels, because hospitality is not just the hotels, it's an entire experience. And at times, it's more what you spend outside of the hotel
Yeah.
than what you spend in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating, this transformation, and also how hotel sector is now sort of really part of the mix of real estate and now offices, and since COVID, of what are we doing with all of this building and space, which sort of brings me on to the
An example on that, although again,
yeah.
hospitality is not necessarily tied to hospitals, which oftentimes I'm personally asked this question, but we have currently an owner that is actually looking at, because they have the benefit of being able to allocate certain floors, is to actually bring in a whole new segment, which is wellness and recovery segment, right, within the hotel. But then they have very dedicated facilities. These are guests that are just looking to switch off. They have different needs to those that are in and out. They just want to be looked after in this hotel context. And
Hmm.
that's another example of how it is not just necessarily what your traditional segments used to be. You can tap into totally new segment as you bring in your wellness, as you bring in your medical into hospitality.
I think it's fascinating, and more of it at the AHIF conference for those listening. So going on to that, I'm sure a lot of this is going to be wrapped up in what you're talking about uh, at the conference. The topic is emerging market projects, do's and don'ts. And I always remember in one of the first ever AHIF conferences, Kurt Ritter, the then CEO of Radisson, being interviewed as a long time supporter, and the question was, what's your advice? And he said, before you buy the bulldozer, speak to us, which I think is a lovely phrase. So, what do's and don'ts would you say are really top of mind in your book, your playbook?
Yeah, I mean, definitely on the dues, these are big investments. These are large investments. No matter how small or big that development, these are large investments. You want to spend money with the right advisors. And if it's not necessarily just at the feasibility study, it is more when it comes to the appointment of the manager being the operator, the choice you make around bringing an operator or getting a franchise or getting different operators at time if it is a mixed use. So it's not just your hotel. There is a lot of value that these consultants and the specialized consultants, I insist, will bring to the table. So that's a big do. I mean, it's not money wasted. On the contrary, if at all, this is going to save you during construction and during operation, and that's a lot of money. On
Get
the
the
do's
right team
as
in
well,
place.
absolutely.
Absolutely.
On the do's as well, you really need to understand your market. So, and that's what I used to make reference to in the Middle East. This is not an emotional investment. This is not about what you want. It's about what the market can absorb and what's going to be relevant. And oftentimes, the conversations we're having with owners, clearly they're excited, they have a certain vision in mind, but unless we can validate it financially, we're hired to actually say, this is beautiful, but it's not relevant to this market, or this is not financially rewarding. So the do's are, you have to understand your market, not your emotions, right? The don'ts, I would say, are along the same lines. You cannot, this is an investment, and this is market driven investment. So you have to answer to your market, going back to that. And the don'ts would be, oftentimes we see that projects are being copied. I mean, yes, one could argue, yeah, but it's just another hotel. No, it's not just another hotel. No, definitely, it's not another study that we do. I mean, even if today we're doing, say, for example, 20 studies in Dubai, I promise you, every location has its own special circumstances and considerations. So it's not just another hotel. It is a development on its own that carries its own risks and rewards. And the concept of, it's been done, and if we do it, it's going to work. It's the wrong concept. That's not what is going to make it work. What is
Yeah.
going to make it work is actually really,
Where's the
again,
gap?
yeah,
Where's the
absolutely.
gap? Head, not heart, and where's the gap? Is
Absolutely.
the good stuff. So, thank you, Hala, for joining today, and Can't wait to catch up next. Last time we saw each other was only a week ago, also in Saudi. Our last comments. Hope to see you in Nairobi very soon.
Definitely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Hala. Bye bye.
Bye.